Jenkins, and I'm the lead of the Greater Portland Conscious Capitalism Chapter. And the chapter has been around for about 2 years now. And if it's your first time joining us, we're so happy that you're here. We've recently started more publicly promoting our events. And so lots of people have been here for us for the whole time, and some new people are joining, sometimes out of curiosity or basically because they're really interested in the presenter. So Neil's a big draw today because we have a big group joining us. And so we're really excited about that. And if you're interested in learning more about our events or joining our mailing list, you can go to the Portland Conscious Capitalism website. We'll put that in the chat at the end, and you can look at our different events going forward, and you can also sign up for our mailing list to get that more actively directly in your inbox. So thank you again for joining us. And I think you all know that the topic today is really talking about what it takes to become a B Corp, and the most recent B Corp organization, Androscoggin Bank, and their CEO, Kiely, here with us to talk about that. And we're going to talk about everything from conscious leadership to what that certification process was like and Neil's decision making, and learn about Androscoggin Bank along the way as well, which will be super exciting. Just a housekeeping item, because I think you're probably all familiar that with groups this size and the size that this will eventually be as more people join, that the chat function can sometimes get a little bit out of control. So we'd really like you to hold your chat until we specifically ask for questions, because otherwise what we find is that people will have too hard a time paying attention to what Neil is saying, which will be super important, at the same time as reading what people are writing in the chat. So if that's okay with everybody as a ground rule, we'll ask you to actively go into the chat, but otherwise we use it pretty sparingly so that we can all focus and be a community together. Anyone have any concerns about that? Okay, great. Well, we're going to start off our session with some context setting to just really find out from Neil, in absence or in replacement of me doing a formal introduction of his bio. We're actually going to have Neil give us whatever he selects to tell about his background by really talking to us, Neil, about your path to becoming the CEO of a B Corp certified bank. So kind of give us some context as to how we got here together with you and why that.
Thank you very much, Tara. I'm really excited to be here with everybody. And the short answer was a very unconventional path. I will say it's a combination of influences and experiences across my entire career. Under the heading of influences, I'd point out, having exposure to kind of two seminal books. One was John Mackay's Be the Solution. Of course, he's the founder of Whole Foods. And the second one is Yvon Chouinard's Let My People Go Surfing. He's the founder of Patagonia. And those two books, which I read years ago, kind of laid out the central tenets for conscious capitalism or multi-stakeholder capitalism. Essentially the idea that companies should think about organizing around serving multiple stakeholders instead of just shareholders, and focus on creating value for all of those stakeholders instead of just financial outcomes or results, which all resonated with me. But a couple of things resonated even more deeply. One is that although they talk about elevating employees to level of stakeholders, which was kind of radical, they actually go a step further and recognize that not only are employees worthy of value creation efforts, but they're also, they have two roles, because they also are the drivers for creating value for all the other stakeholders. So maybe they're first among equals, which made sense to me. And in terms of the leadership principles that they kind of outlined in order to run a company this way, the first one was this kind of deep care for your stakeholders, right? You have to have a deep care and passion and empathy for all of your stakeholders. And then beyond that, it's all about trust building. So, from my experience early in my career as an employee, that kind of culture and that approach resonated with me. But especially when I became a business owner and running my own companies and kind of building my own cultures, did it really profoundly resonate with me. I think my experience for other business owners on the phone will share this. And in Maine, people don't start companies just to make money. They start because they have a passion and they want to serve others. They don't look at employees as labor input, right? And we know that they're the backbone of philanthropy and service in our communities. And we saw both of those exemplified during the pandemic. We saw CEOs and leaders and business owners go to great lengths for their employees and to support the communities. So this all was really intuitive to me. Later in life, I had the kind of unique experience of going back to be an employee again after having run my own companies. And I landed in a renewable energy company fortuitously, and I was surrounded by, I would say, passionate, purpose-driven colleagues. And it was an incredible environment. And to be part of that was incredibly fulfilling and oftentimes fun, although candidly it was, they stretched my capabilities because they set the bar so high. So I had that experience as an employee, but I also, as a former business owner, watched the output. And I saw what these teams were able to do that was staggering and compared to our competition. So I had all of this kind of, I guess, rumbling around. And then in 2013, I had a kind of a personal experience. We had a house fire, which is a traumatic experience. There's no way to kind of describe it any other way. But it was also, an experience my wife and I, was the first time that we'd have been on the receiving end. I don't say necessarily of charity, but of service. Right? We had this invisible safety net of family and friends and neighbors and strangers come out and hold our family. And it was a profound experience, I think, for both of us. But for me particularly, it really distilled out what was important to me and helped me reprioritize what I want to do with my life and my gifts and capabilities going forward. So fast forward, about 2 years later, I had joined the board of the bank. I'm not a lifelong banker, which is somewhat unconventional. And the former CEO, Paul Anderson, took me aside one day and said, I have this crazy idea. What would you think about stepping off the board into management and helping me lead a transformation of the bank to reposition us, to make sure we stay relevant in the midst of all this change that's happening in our industry? And it was a no-brainer for me. 2 reasons. I saw it as a unique opportunity. First, to be part of building a company and a culture that I would have wanted to work at every stage of my own career. And 2, to kind of put all these principles and practices into practice, if you will, to demonstrate you not only survive running this model, you can actually thrive, right? And so, I guess 5 years later, sitting here, B Corp certified is the culmination of this very kind of long journey that started years ago and made a non-banker into a banker as an opportunity to kind of pursue this model.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's such a great explanation. And so you talked about 5 years ago. So you've been at the bank for 5 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, came inside in 2015. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a perfect time to talk about then the work that you did to sort of pave the path to becoming a certified B Corp. Like, what were you doing to build that foundation before you went for the certification?
That's a great question. I know there's a lot of folks on the phone today that want to know what's involved in the process. And I don't want to give the mistaken impression that we decided to become B Corp certified and flicked a switch and they mailed the certification. There was a lot of foundational work that went into this. Again, when I came in, I was, the first title was Chief Strategy Officer. And the idea was, how are we going to stay relevant? And we looked at what was happening in the industry, and we came to the conclusion, the only thing that was guaranteed not to change in our industry is that our clients would always be human beings. And the only thing we know they would continue to value is relationships. And we also realized that, clients don't have relationships with a company or a bank. They have relationships with other human beings, namely employees. So we asked ourselves the question is how can we set out to try to attract and retain the best possible employees out there, and then kind of set them up and empower them to kind of build these deep relationships and create value for our clients. And the answer we got was, it comes down to culture. And so the question becomes, well, in every small business, people kind of build culture naturally. It's an extension of the business owner. It happens organically. But when you have 187 employees in multiple locations in a financial institution that's been around for 150 years, it's a whole different ball of wax. You have to be really intentional about it. So, part of our learning was, well, it really comes down to this framework of mission, vision, values. Why do you exist? What's the meaningfulness of your work? Where are you going? What does success look like? And how do you agree to act along the way? So part of the foundation for us was running this grassroots process with our employees. We actually engaged representatives from across the bank, and then we did focus groups to kind of craft the answers to these questions. And once we arrived at consensus, we all looked at each other and said, yes, this is it. We turned to kind of rebuilding the bank itself from the foundations to say, okay, if we embrace multiple stakeholders, our clients, our employees, and our communities, how are we going to deliver value creation at the highest levels of excellence? And so we've rebuilt our technology, we've hired people, we've done all kinds of change and transformation in the bank. But as part of that, we were continually trying to embed our mission, vision, values into the bank itself. So for one example is that we thought about our employee, the value to offer our employees and the culture we want to build. We thought about all the things that our employees worry about outside of work, right? All the anxieties. And so we said, one, we want to start with, we want to make sure we're paying a living wage as benchmarked against the MIT index by geography. Two, we want to build a package or portfolio of benefits to address all of those potential anxieties. So for example, how do we take care of the medical needs of our families, the mental health needs of our families? What happens if we have a child while we're working? How do we pay for our own college education? How do we, prepare for retirement? And so if we try to do all of that in the first year, it would have been beyond our resources. But we had a plan and we layered those in over time. And as a result, when we turned to the B-Lab questionnaire and they asked, do you pay a living wage? We could say with confidence, yes. And when they asked what type of benefit package, we could proudly say, this is our benefit package. And we know benchmarked against industry, it's a leading package. And we could actually then look beyond it. The next question is, well, what are your participation levels? And we could demonstrate that. So there's a lot of foundational work that happened over those 3 years before we made the decision to pursue the certification.
I love those practical examples that you just gave, because mission, vision, and values is something that a lot of companies have, and sometimes just on paper or maybe just on the website, but haven't embedded them into the organization and activated them in very real ways. So it's really helpful to hear the specific examples of that, and perhaps you'll get some more questions at the end about that. I want to mention to the participants that Neil and I have a series of stuff that questions we're going to go through, and then there will be time at the end for you to ask questions. So don't worry, keep holding those questions, and we'll have some time at the end. But you just really teed up, Neil, in a great way, us talking about what made you decide after that 3-year period of time where you were laying all that foundation in place to go for being a certified B Corp as a bank.
So it really, I think, came down to 3 reasons. The first one was that we had been doing this work, we'd been doing it in a silo, and we felt we were making progress, but we really wanted to benchmark ourselves against like-minded companies to see if our actions met our intentions. So the idea of kind of testing our assumptions, and 2, the opportunity to say if there were gaps, to have access to this community of other companies that we could trade best practices with. So that was one reason, I thought we were ready to at least test ourselves. The second reason I think is a real driver for us, and that is that in that short time, we noticed that the quality and the nature of the employees we had, purpose-driven, really passionate, had already started to differentiate us in the marketplace. It was having a profound impact. And we want to ensure that we'd be able to continue to retain those folks and attract similar folks going forward. And at the same time, the people that have gone down this journey with us, the people that stayed at the bank, when we went down this path, and the people that joined us along the way, really did so with the understanding of being part of this kind of journey of vision that we had laid out. And I felt at that time, we owed it to them to kind of ensure that we were making a full commitment to stay on this path. I didn't want them to wake up one day and I get hit by a truck or the board turned over to learn that the bank decided to go down a different path. I didn't think that would be equitable. So making that commitment to our existing employees and to future employees that we're going to go down this path by embracing the certification. And then, as you know, Tara, there's a second step where we have to actually change our legal documentation to become a benefit corporation. So literally embedding this into our legal DNA, is an execution of the commitment to our employees. And lastly, the third reason was, even before COVID hit, we noticed that there was this growing sentiment among community employees, et cetera, that they wanted businesses to do more, right? They wanted companies to focus on solving bigger problems than just making a profit. Some observers noticed that perhaps people have lost a little faith in government to solve some of the bigger societal problems. And while our nonprofits do heroic work, they're often under-resourced. And I think COVID just accelerated this kind of sentiment dramatically, where people came out on certain issues and said, you know what, we want companies to step in and fill this gap. Take all the energy, the talent, the capabilities, the innovation, strategic thinking you have, and lend it to, beyond making a dollar, apply it to more stakeholders and to other problems. And so even before it hit, we said this was, our way of kind of signaling that we were ready to answer that call. And so those are the 3 primary drivers.
And Neil, could you give us a little bit of color about, as a bank being a certified B Corp, what does that mean differently about the way that you operate day to day? Like, what would you say are some specific examples about if people are used to a banking experience with their bank, who is most likely not a certified B Corp unless they're with Androscoggin, right, or Soma? What would you say is different about the customer experience?
I'll say what I hope is different about what we found, and I'll say the certification really layered on the work that we've done for the last couple of years, right? It's this idea, this orientation that we are here to create value for our stakeholders, that clients are a stakeholder, employees are a stakeholder, and communities are a stakeholder, and that we truly put their interests first. So we're never negotiating against a client, right? We're balancing interests. We're a mutual bank. Think about it. Our depositors want the highest interest possible. Our borrowers want the lowest interest possible, right? And so we have to kind of structure that to balance between the two and earn enough profit to kind of take care of our employees, give back to our community. So there's no person behind the veil. There's no alternative motive, right? All our interests are aligned. As a mutual, essentially, our depositors essentially own the bank, and we kind of, we treat them that way. So it's really a different in attitude and perspective. The other real difference, I think, is the quality and the nature of the employees, which drives the client experience. And I think that's what we've seen. That really offers the biggest differentiation. If you have highly passionate, engaged employees who are here because they want to be of service, they want to have meaningful work, that's the biggest differentiator, I think, that you'll find. And I think it's the other piece is, people can have confidence that we take great care of our employees, and that we have local decision makers. We are part and parcel of our community. We saw that through PPP, right? We answered the phone when other folks were having trouble getting through to some of the larger institutions, perhaps, and we lend through the cycle, right? So I think it's really just a commitment of who we are, and they have confidence now. The transparency and the accountability. It's more of like, show me, don't tell me.
Yeah.
We have to back it up with this recertification every 3 years. So that's probably the biggest difference.
Thank you. That's so helpful. But why I love what you highlighted is the mutual bank aspect, not being familiar with the banking industry myself over the course of my career, and learning about that relatively recently is a real distinction in, I think, the way that we can think about banks as customers. So I'm glad that you highlighted that. And if it's something that audience you're not familiar with, you'll have time to ask a little more questions about that, but it's interesting model that I just wasn't aware of. So thank you for sharing that, Neil. And so here's a sort of reflection question around, what did you learn about the B Corp process that surprised you while you're going through it? And maybe at the same time, kind of what did you wish what do you know now that you wished you knew then when you sort of embarked on that, as people are considering it or interested in learning more about it?
So, I knew about the B Corp certification for a number of years. And that was always in the back of my mind, as an aspiration, a goal, personally and with the company. I didn't know much about the process. So, for example, and I'll kind of share some of this with folks on the phone. There's a 200 question survey that you take across 5 areas, and it basically comes down to how well do you treat your employees, your clients, how do you engage with your community, what are your practices around sustainability or your environmental footprint, and what are your practices around governance and transparency. And the first learning is that nobody can hit all 200. Right? The questions are geared to different industries, so it's tailored. I didn't know that, but nobody can hit the 200, and that's okay. You need to have a score an 80 as a threshold. The individual questions are weighted differently, right? Which I also didn't know. I think most surprisingly, I also didn't know that the questions can change. So when we go to recertify in 3 years, those questions will be different. So in one sense, it's a little disconcerting. The goalposts can move. At the same time, I think it underscores the authenticity and the integrity of the process, because they don't want you to kind of teach to the test, if you will, or kind of study for the test. They want you to do the right thing, and that should show up in the questions. The other thing I didn't know is that you can take the survey before you formally go through the process. So you can take the survey and see how you score, and then determine, what are our gaps and are we close? And I'll just share that, the 2 executives that led this effort in our team, Michelle Love and Jeff Smith, I thought was a great approach. When they answered a question, they said, if we were in a court of law, could we put our hand up and swear, yes, that we do this? And 2, could we also demonstrate that we do it? And if they couldn't answer yes, they wouldn't give themselves credit for that question, right? So I think that was, and then you can see at the end, if you score with a certain buffer, then you feel that you'll have some point. If you lose some points during the validation process, you'll still be okay. That was the other learning. We get audited by numerous orders, federal regulators, state regulators on a yearly basis. They alternate. We have financial auditors and all kinds of specialized auditors. So we have a lot of experience being audited and answer these type of surveys. This was rigorous by any standard, right? They are serious about protecting the integrity of the certification. So you answer the questions. Once you formally go through the process, you answer the questions, and then they come back and they ask follow-up questions. And then again, there could be another round of questions, and then validation. Can you document it all? So all of those, I think, are on the process. On the positive side of the learnings, your head down, you're going through this process, you're answering questions, and you're like, are we going to make it, et cetera. And then suddenly when you get the letter that you've made it, they open the doors wide and they just expose you to this incredible community and all of these resources. It's just, they call it the beehive at the national level. And there are teams and committees and forums from all different companies trading ideas, and the excitement is great and the content is phenomenal. Then there's a regional organization in Boston. And then here in Portland and Maine, there's about, I think, 10 or 11 B Corp certified companies that have a new community. And the quality of the people there, the engagement, the enthusiasm is fantastic. So that was a surprise to me, a pleasant surprise. Another one I think would say is that the value of the certification is less about the certification itself. It's more about B Corp as an organizing principle, as a framework to explain to your employees, your clients, and others what you're doing, and to plan your work and your resources and to kind of fill gaps. So it's really helpful there. And I'd say that the biggest value that I didn't realize at the time is that this approach requires you to be incredibly intentional about every aspect of your business. In every decision you make, you have to weigh out the implications on multiple stakeholders. And as you think about making improvements across your company, you have to layer out resources. And of course, you have to wrap it all in, financial discipline. And I think that because it demands such a level of intentionality, necessarily will elevate you in terms of excellence. And that's going to come through in the client experience, the client value creation, employee experience, community, et cetera. So these were all pluses. I knew the certification had value at the first level to validate, we're doing what we try to accomplish and to learn. I didn't recognize the full value as an organizing principle and this, this commands or demands in terms of intentionality. So those are the things I think the learnings I took away from the process.
Thank you. I love how you described those that were working on the certification as going through the business impact assessment and sort of putting up their hand in the court of law and then saying, like, could we prove it? Because my experience in working with clients that are considering this, or I'll just suggest that they go do the BIA, they'll come back and say, oh, we scored a 70. And I'll be like, so I'm going to use that and say, like, could you put your hand up and swear to court of law? And then how would you show that? Because they're going to seriously ask you to show how you're doing that. It's not just like that you think you are, or that you pretend to do it, or whatever it is. It's like you have to show it. It has to be written down somewhere in order to demonstrate that. So that's a great way to really hold yourself authentic and true to what they're asking you to do.
Well, I'll just share too briefly is that, kudos, because Michelle and Jeff that went through this process. Michelle was familiar with B Corp. She actually done her MBA, I think, thesis on B Corp certification. So she was an enthusiastic supporter. Jeff had not been exposed to it at all. And I think when the pandemic hit, we naturally said, should we pause this or stop? And Jeff, even though he had not been exposed to it, they're both like, no, we shouldn't. We saw the pandemic unfold is that this was more pressing in the need. And so a special thank you to them. And there were other folks on the team. This was a +1 job. It wasn't an official project from finance and other places in the bank that just did this, on their own, I should say their own time, but in addition to all their other duties, because they were compelled, so passionate about it. So I can't thank them enough.
Yeah, that's really important to call out. And another really important group would be your board. So you mentioned, doing the B Corp certification in and of itself is a big impact on resources, both from people and financial, and there's, board sponsorship typically involved with that, but also there is a legal factor in changing to a benefit corporation. And so tell us a little bit about how did you approach your board with this? Because that can be an obstacle for leaders who feel very motivated to do this, but then have to get a board on board, so to speak, with this initiative.
So yes, well, it's interesting because the foundational discussion around this didn't happen at the time of the B Corp certification recently. That foundational discussion happened a couple of years ago. We talked about becoming a mission-driven, values-based company. And the two dimensions there, the first was, well, what are the constraints of being a values-based company? And I remember saying to the board, it's like, I don't know how this will constrain us, but it will constrain us. We have to be thoughtful about that. And that was one piece. And the second piece was about the role of profitability and finance. And I think because although this, we have, our board is great and we have business owners on there, and I think again, with them, just like with me, it resonates. Like, this makes complete sense. But to your point, as a fiduciary, they have a fiduciary obligation as a director of a financial institution, which is with profit matters. In the sense, we are a mutual bank, so we don't have shareholders. However, the corollary of that is we can't go to the public markets to access capital. So we can only grow out of earnings. We can only invest for the future out of earnings. So profits are really important. And believe me, profits are incredibly important to our regulators. So that was a key issue. And I think this is where we talked a little about this, Tara, before, that the soundbite of purpose over profits is really not helpful to the conversation, because it reinforces this idea that the pie of value is fixed. And that if we invest an extra dollar in benefits for our employees, that's an extra dollar that comes out of the pocket of the bank's earnings or what we can do for our clients. And instead, you have to look at it with a kind of a growth mindset to say that, this is the discussion we have with the board, is that we believe that if we go forward and focus on creating value for all these stakeholders and over time, and we run our business with operational excellence and financial discipline, we can grow the pie for everybody, right? But at that point in time, the board had to take a leap of faith. Now, so when we, fast forward, we sat down and talked about certification. We had gone over that threshold, and they had a couple of years to see the results. They had seen our employee engagement scores go up dramatically, followed by our client satisfaction scores. They had seen the fact that, we were recruiting 8 out of 10 of our employees were recruited by other employees, which is a powerful endorsement of the culture. But it's also a competitive advantage when people come to you pre-qualified for character, cultural fit, and performance, because they've been recommended by somebody in the bank. They saw the testimonials and the referrals go through the roof from our clients. So they felt comfortable on the model. But the question is exactly what you raised. And okay, well, actually, one of the best questions was, is B Lab's kind of lens on mission, vision, values, and what's important consistent with what ours is? Or is that going to constrain us from doing the right thing? That was a great question. The next question, though, is like, well, what happens if we lose certification? What's the implication? It's a real concern. And then, of course, the legal implications of changing our corporate documents after 150 years. And so those are all good dialogue, I think. But ultimately, I think what carried us through is, I pointed out to the board, I said, when we asked them to make that foundational decision 3 or 4 years ago, they had to take a courageous leap of faith, because there was no local company that I could point to that I could say they did this. That's not to say there was not a local company that was operating that way. I was not aware of it, full disclosure. I said, so imagine if the next company or board is wrestling with this and they can point to us. And as a financial institution, that nobody can say, well, they don't care about profitability or financial outcomes. And I was helped in this regard because although there was no one around a few years ago to point to, when it came to B Corp certification, we were able to point to our friends at Androscoggin Bank over in New Hampshire, Clay Adams, the CEO over there, and Todd Batchelder, who's the commercial lender here in town, who got certified a couple of years ago, which was really compelling to our board, because okay, they navigated all the regulatory questions that we would have. And they, in the best B Corp spirit, they were really forthcoming and sharing their experience with us, which I was able to share with the board. So this idea of like, hey, what kind of impact can we have if we can kind of be a model for other companies? And if other companies kind of emulate this model, like ours and other B Corps, then their employees benefit, their clients benefit, and our entire main community benefits. And I think that's really what, brought the board into consensus, although, they're really there with us. And we have their kind of full, unbridled support at this point.
So important to consider for leaders considering this path or getting more curious about it, that you have emphasized continuously the importance of that foundation that you laid in advance of introducing B Corp certification, and that you'd proven that it was working. So it wasn't like you had to talk the board into anything at the point that you went into this, bigger process. There sounds like some really meaningful and important questions to consider strategically, right, but that you weren't caught in the trying to talk anybody into anything mode. It was more of a business decision-making, legitimate business decision-making, which is what I would hope for every leader is the position they're in.
I think so. I think especially in here in Maine, I think, people are receptive to this approach because it resonates, right? Who doesn't want to work in a great culture, and who doesn't think that a great culture is going to deliver, better results for clients, and that, clients in turn are going to go, enter a deeper relationship with you and then send their friends and referrals, right? It's very common sense, but it's it's different from kind of the narrative we've had out there, the Milton Friedman approach about, shareholder primacy. And so it's a thoughtful decision for businesses or people or partners in a business to make. There's no doubt.
And so you probably, based on all the wonderful things you've shared, Neil, have a number of people on here considering whether they might want to go for it, or considering how they might create the path as a foundation, as you've described, to eventually, as you said, you had it in your head for a period of time, and then there seemed to be that moment where it made sense. So what advice would you give the folks that are considering it on this call?
I think the first advice, and I'm sure that doesn't apply to anybody in this call, but I would just caution, do this for the right reasons. Do it for authenticity. I think we've seen in the past, you hear the terms greenwashing or pinkwashing, where folks, do window dressing or take efforts in a sense to try and fool people that they're actually kind of embracing these issues. And I think that if, I would want caution anybody that heard my explanation about the pie and say, well, this is actually a great way to make more money. So let's go down it for that reason, because I regret to tell you it won't work, right? Because at the foundation of this is really with your employees especially, is that, you've got to be authentically committed to it. And if you're not, they're way too smart and they'll know it. So it's not going to work. I think beyond that, it's, with your eyes wide open, we described this process. It's about building a foundation. It is challenging. There's no doubt. It's also immensely rewarding. So I think with your eyes wide open, I'd also say, just most importantly too, is, if you're sitting there and you're thinking, my goodness, I have a younger company, or I don't have these resources, or I'm, post-COVID, I'm just trying to keep my head above water. I don't want to set the idea that B Corp certification is the only path, right? And the only standard that, to access this kind of approach. First of all, there are other certifications out there, or there are other measures that you can report out on that you can look at. And whether B Corp's the gold standard or not, it is one standard. It's a rigorous standard we chose to pursue, obviously. But secondly, even if you can't meet that standard now or in the immediate future, I wouldn't let that deter you from walking the path and thinking about these issues. And I think, this is a great place, this chapter, which I've been in from the beginning, I think, is a great way to get access. I know, Tara, I've actually participated in some of your webinars to learn your perspective, which is great, because you always want to keep learning. And to hear people like Kevin Hancock speak, and other leaders doing this work, and we're all kind of plowing the ground for the first time. So there's a lot of folks and resources around here to kind of start down the path. So I wouldn't say, well, if I can't do that, I don't want to start down the path. That's probably the biggest thing. And then ask for help, right? That's the other piece. The spirit of what Mascoma did for us is, I'm happy to do for others. If you have to have a conversation with a board or a partner, an investor, and you want to bounce somebody off, bounce it off somebody, this is Maine. Pick up the phone and ask somebody. That would be my advice. I will say though, coming on the other side of this, not just the certification, but I think my experience is deeply fulfilling to me, and what's been reflected back by our employees is that the certification is another milestone on a journey that is meaningful to them and fulfilling to them to be part of that culture. And there's no better feeling, I think, to be part of a community like this.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Neil. So before we turn it over to everyone for questions, one last question just to help us get future oriented is, what's next for Androscoggin Bank? Like, what are you planning as the next thing you're going to lead the bank through?
So I think, in the short term, really it's, three things. First, we're looking to make sure that we match again our commitments with resources. So we're in the process of recruiting for a director of corporate impact, which I know hopefully folks have seen the link. If not, look it up, and we're getting some great resumes. But if you know of anyone, please send them our way. And part of that person's responsibility will be the next phase of helping to set up our B team structure. Part of the B Corp philosophy is that you organize your employees into teams to kind of focus on looking at your scores in certain of these pillars, and then how you get better. So that will be one kind of major effort, and how we incorporate B Corp certification into everything we do. The next thing we'll look at over the course of this year is, we're going to go back and revisit our mission, vision, values. Not necessarily in light of B Corp, the B Corp changes it, but to say it's just another milestone to say we've been living these for a few years. Do they still resonate? Do they still make sense? Do we have more clarity that we want to incorporate? We may not change a word, But we found what was really powerful the first time was going through this with all of our employees, this grassroots efforts. We've had a number of folks who have joined us. So being able to bring their voices into that and get more clarity about it will be really important. And the third thing we're working about is thinking about is like, what is our particular social value proposition or social impact that we want to strive to achieve? And, the best thought leadership I'm seeing around this is that, try to identify things that are within your wheelhouse and align with your business strategy to have the biggest impact. So for example, I have a background in renewable energy. We have some folks in the bank I know that are passionate about that. And we will have a team that's focused on sustainability. We are, working right now to purchase, solar energy from a local Maine solar farm. That's one example. And then beyond what we do in the bank, we'll look to support other organizations doing this work. But we're a bank, right? We're not in the extractive industry of oil and gas, and we don't have things going into, waste product going into landfills. So, there's a certain amount of scope and impact that we can have in that arena. Where we can really have an impact arena is in our wheelhouse, and we serve a lot of folks, but we think we serve business owners, their families, and their employees particularly well. We have a deep expertise there, passionate teams. And so the question for us is, what if we were to focus on serving women and minority business owners, folks that have historically had difficulty accessing the financial system? And what if we can work within our system to find solutions that not only change the system for our bank, but maybe can permeate and have a great impact across the industry? And what would be the impact in our communities if we empower these individuals to grow companies within their communities? So things like that is kind of, that's another guidance that I'm seeing out there, which is more integrated, more sustainable. And the last piece along those lines is looking at our partnerships with community partners. Is there a way that we can pioneer a new model there to go beyond the big check and photograph, and beyond just sitting on a board, to bring our talents, abilities, energy, and creativity to some of these partners to actually help them move the needle on their mission. So that's the kind of work that's ahead of us. And then of course, just, the day-to-day job of, taking great care of, our clients. And then I'm sure as we go into do all the work I just described, the next milestones or the next achievements will become clear for us.
Well, that's certainly plenty to share, in addition to keeping the lights on. And you reminded me, because you and I didn't get to talk about this, Neil, because I forgot about this overlap, that Prosperity Maine, an organization that is working to empower immigrants to be successful in our community. Androscoggin Bank is working closely on one of the initiatives that you talked about in Lewiston. And so it's an example of like, you're really authentically, genuinely doing this work. So to your point of like, not wanting to do it just for the sake of, being a part of a club or getting some kind of certification, like the ongoing work that it requires to really do the meaningful work to continue to get recertified and continue to work with the community to demonstrate your genuine authenticity in being this type of organization is clear among a number of different facets. So thank you so much for doing all that work in the community.
Well, thank you, Chair. But I would point out that's a great example is that, for this is about having an impact in the world. And if you want to have the biggest impact, you have to collaborate, right? It's a network effect, right? And the companies like organizations like Prosperity Maine, which are just so impressive on so many levels. So, for us to kind of, to speak with them, engage them, get their guidance and say, how do we work together to have a bigger impact? And then hopefully, eventually leverage other relationships, other businesses, perhaps in our circle of influence who don't have the infrastructure that we do, they don't have a director of corporate impact, but say like, we'd like to piggyback on your network and to get involved with some of these companies. That would be the next level for us. How do we bring in other folks, some of the consultants to say, hey, listen, would you meet with some of these companies? We'll may be able to do some financing, but can you give some consulting? That's the really exciting piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So for some of you, I see lots of new names here, which is absolutely wonderful, and so welcome to join us at any time, as I mentioned at the start of our time together. Some of this might feel potentially confusing because it's a little bit of alphabet soup when you're learning about being a certified B Corp, and then we're talking about benefit corporations, and then you're at a conscious capitalism meeting and you're like, what is going on here? And what do all these things mean? And what basically you can think about is this is all part of the benefit economy. It's a movement that we are all working on together. And there's just different iterations or different ways to approach the movement. And they're all in collaboration with each other, and all sisters to each other is the way that I talk about it. So if you want to learn more, we are holding some informational sessions, and Neil has been an awesome participant in those in the past, where we just kind of deep dive into the B economy, or what higher purpose means in conscious capitalism, or some of the other tenets. So if you join our mailing list or go to our website, you'll see those being offered if you're curious about some of the language we've been using and just want to learn more, because it can be a little bit confusing. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over for questions. You see that Darren put in the chat our website, so for the chapter, so you can definitely check that out. And then you're welcome to put questions in the chat, and we'll try to manage those. And you're also very welcome to come off mute and ask Neil a question, and we'll just spend whatever time we have left till 4 o'clock answering as many questions as we can. So feel free to jump in and get off mute if you'd like to start. Oh, go ahead, Nate. You want to ask your question that you put in the chat? That'd be great.
Yeah, if you don't mind. You might be able to tell by the last name, ESOPs are obviously pretty near and dear to my heart. So I guess I'm curious, in what ways do you see from a cultural perspective, sort of the certified B Corp overlap with ESOPs, and which ways do you sort of see them as distinctly different? And obviously I see Revision Energy, and I know they're both, so maybe they can join in as well. But I'm just curious where you see that sort of distinction and where you see that overlap.
Oh, it's interesting. And for folks on the phone that don't know it, ESOP, employee stock owned plan, which essentially is when typically in a sale of a company, the owners will transfer ownership over the employees, and the employees kind of run the company. It's interesting. So we're, obviously as a mutual bank, we don't have shareholders, so our stockholders kind of do that. So I think the ESOP is probably the ultimate manifestation of employee empowerment and employee stakeholder. There's probably no doubt about that. But I'd leave it to Phil or Revision to talk about that more specifically, having been an ESOP and a B Corp. But I think that, it's one thing to say that, an ESOP vests ownership into the employees and makes them a stakeholder. You could have that, and you could still have an organization that is strictly focused on profit, right? Without that. So I think they're different approaches. One is a structure that makes you a stakeholder, but it's also, are you recognizing other stakeholders? Are you recognizing environmental sustainability and other pieces? So they can layer on, as Revision's done, they can layer very effectively. And
Fortunat, if you wouldn't mind sharing any of your insight into that, because you'd have plenty, you're welcome to do that. And then Erica has noted in the chat that this chapter will be having a panel on ESOPs on June 4th. So you can go to the website and sign up for that too, but Fortunat, definitely add in whatever you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Neil said. I think they are two strongly complementary things. As you say, employee ownership sort of collapses two of your primary stakeholders in your shareholders and your employees, and that is that makes, in some ways, that makes the sort of rest of the B Corp stuff easier, because two of your 5 or 6 primary stakeholders are now sort of definitionally aligned. But it is, I would say there's lots of employee-owned companies who are still bastards, and and there's lots of B Corps that are still closely held, and so they're not entirely overlapping. There is, for those who are interested in that, there's been some pretty interesting efforts around this by an organization called 50 by 50 and Democracy Collaborative down in, I think, out of the Stern School at NYU, around the power of employee ownership and mission-driven business in combination together. It was a pretty good report a couple of years ago. Happy to share if anyone's interested.
Thanks, Fortunat. That's awesome. And Jeffrey asked a question about playbooks in the chat, and Wendy, thank you to giving a link to a playbook from B Lab. So that's awesome. B Lab is kind of the mother company of the B Corp certification process, and there is tons of information on their website as well about the certification process. It's also where you can find the business impact assessment, or what's called the BIA, that Neil mentioned earlier, that you can do for free to sort of check out how the process works and see where you might stand in your organization. Again, using the model of I take the oath and I can prove it, as Neil described before. Jeffrey, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Sorry, I was just taking the oath.
Oh, thank you. Alrighty, that's spreading.
Thanks for that. The resources is really what I was looking for,
Okay.
and I appreciate it.
Great.
And also, Neil, thank you for your time. It's really been helpful to hear your journey with this.
My
Great.
pleasure.
And Tara, thank you.
Oh yeah, of course. My absolute pleasure. What other questions do people have? I'm just going to check the chat quickly. Any other questions for Neil about his journey or what's next, or any other general questions for the group? Because we have lots of experts here that can probably answer questions.
This is Becky. I have a question. Thank you, Neil, so much. This was really inspiring. We are in the process. We've submitted our B Corp assessment, and we're in the queue for an auditor. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how we regularly communicate all of the metrics to the team. And I was curious if you've already have some rhythms of how you talk with your team or your board about all of the KPIs for B Corp.
So great questions, and I would say candidly no. So a little bit of the dog that caught the car, and that is part of the next phase for us. Is there's an annual B Corp. We're looking at kind of integrating probably our annual reporting requirement with our formal annual report as a bank, and we'll be looking at our KPIs. But that's hopefully be part of the work of the B team and the employee teams within their areas to look at not only the B Corp assessment. I will suggest that we will go broader. So we will certainly look at the B Lab questions or KPIs and areas, but we'll probably look at measurements from some of these other organizations. Well, there's a Sustainable Accounting Standards Board that has a special set of metrics, reporting measures for financial institutions. And there's a number of other reporting metrics out there that we may just kind of also incorporate into that, but that'll probably be part of the next phase for us. But I think, I would kind of applaud your efforts to think about that transparency and how you get that cadence of, accountability and sharing, and recognize too, I think this is not going to be a linear process. I think in all humility, realize we will, maybe take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And although, we're highly aspirational, we're an institution full of human beings. So I think the other thing is we will stumble in some regards. We will not do things perfectly, and try to be transparent about that. And hopefully, you're in the trust of your stakeholders that they recognize that and they stay with you on this journey. So best of luck in the validation process.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Becky. Any other questions?
I was just going to make a quick point, and Neil, thank you. That was an outstanding presentation. I was just going to throw out the fact that UNH's B Impact Clinic is a great way for companies to kind of test the waters. And I think, Neil, you might have gone through that. Becky, if I'm correct, you may be going through that as well. So, I know there are a few companies that have gone through that clinic and have ultimately gone on to certification. And on a twice a year basis, Fiona Wilson at UNH and a group of her students are helping companies go through the 200 questions about the impact certification or B Lab certification.
So Todd, that's actually a great reference. We were not able to go through it because we couldn't get the timing to line up for us, but we did explore it. We were very impressed with them, and I have spoken to other companies that have gone through it as well, other companies in Maine. So that's a great reference because they have a tremendous amount of resources, and you're working with these students, which I've heard is really compelling.
Yeah, I have a client that's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that too, Todd. I have a client that's going through that now with that group and has their own set of students. And they recently compared the students and the motivation and drive of the students to consultants and other really highly esteemed professionals, and said the students were doing better. So I think that's a good tribute to that program, and the amount of resources and headway that you can make in really understanding where you're at on the BIA after you've done your own assessment to really help figure out what your situation is and get all your ducks in a row, so to speak, to potentially apply, I think is another really important piece, because internal resources are sometimes the second challenge to the board part that we already talked about, Neil, just like,
right.
As you said, people were doing this in addition to their regular jobs at Androscoggin Bank. And I think that's generally the case for most organizations that are going after it. So that's another element to consider.
Absolutely.
Glad you mentioned that, Todd. What other questions do we have in our last few minutes?
Hi, Neil. I just wanted to ask, I remember you saying like 5 years ago when you started talking about this, it was based on kind of nothing being certain in banking and that you wanted to focus on the people. So I'm curious, 5 years later after COVID, like, is there a more certainty about like where banking is going, and how does that influence maybe the strategy changing for the B Corp side of things going forward?
I think the only say wherever it's going there faster. So I'll say that. And I think there's still less certainty. I think that we have all these dynamics happening within the industry. We have technology, we have these fintechs, and now the big techs coming into the space. So there's a lot of change. I think for us, we're not being benchmarked against the bank down the street. We're getting benchmarked for the technology experience for Apple and Amazon, so in one sense. But through it all, I think we saw through PPP, folks came and realized that relationships matter even more, especially the local community. I think folks, it came through to us and the response we got from our clients. So we feel really confident. Again, I wouldn't say there's a tremendous amount more clarity of what's going to happen in the industry. There's still a lot of consolidation and change, but I think we would say we are much more confident that we're on the right path. That if you focus on relationships, within your community, building that culture and then reflecting outside those deep relationships, no matter what happens, we'll be okay. One, because we think clients will value those relationships, and especially our business clients value those relationships more than trying to do online banking with, someone at the national level who may not answer the phone in a crisis, for example. And I think also within our, if we have a great culture and really talented, high-performing employees, they will be the source of the solutions to enable us to pivot, to continue to be relevant to our clients going forward. That's really the secret sauce. It's the capability. This world's just going to continue to change. That pace of change is going to accelerate. It's really the resiliency and the innovation, the capabilities of your human capital that become your competitive advantage going forward. So, we're fully confident that we're going down the right path. It's a great question, though. And if you find out, let me know.
So any last burning questions before we wrap up today? It's been such an amazing conversation, Neil, and we had great participation from the group. Do we have one more, or is everyone feeling full for this afternoon? Okay, well, it looks like everybody's full, Neil, because you've given us so much to think about, and really appreciate the time and how articulate you were and thoughtful you were in answering the questions from everybody. And I see lots of smiling faces and interesting people. I really appreciate that many of you have stayed on video, because that's really nice that it makes it a little bit of a community, particularly for Neil, as he can look at people rather than just me. So thank you for doing that too. And then also recognize some people can't do that, but they've still been here, and certainly their presence has been felt. So we really appreciate everybody's time this afternoon. We know that there's lots of competing priorities, particularly in Zoom world, where you have to constantly make decisions about where your next screen is going to be. And so please continue to follow us and check out the website, as Darren put in the chat, and sign up for our future events if you're interested. And you can reach out to me or Darren at any point for more information. And we'll put also our emails directly in the chat as well. So thank you very much, and everybody have a great afternoon.